Okay, good morning and welcome. I'm Jeanette Dubinin, Director of Resilience and Adaptation at CPEX, and I'm really glad you're here with us today. We're excited to continue Climate Week at the Summit and look forward to a thought-provoking conversation about the intersection of climate change, public health, economy, and planning in today's session, Climate and COVID-19, a diabolical duo. You might wonder what planning has to do with climate change and public health. The answer is everything. As we have seen throughout the course of our work with Louisiana communities, climate change impacts such as sea level rise and land loss are changing them. While some of our coastal communities might be planning for survival, others might be unprepared for the influx of people moving to them from yet another flooding event. Our duty as planners is to look ahead, anticipate the changes that are coming, and proactively identify economic opportunities, infrastructure investments, and ways to benefit from a sustainable environment that provides for everyone. So I want to tell you a little anecdote about how we've built our communities to not be conducive for those conditions. When I moved from Germany to the suburbs of Washington, D.C., the first week we lived in a hotel. It was across from a mall and with a metro station nearby. As a member of the AAA, we were able to get a free map of our surroundings, and so we set off to the AAA office to get the map and acquaint ourselves with our new place of residence. We asked the concierge for directions. He said, 10 minutes that way, and off we went. 10 minutes later, we still hadn't arrived at the AAA, so we went into a Pizza Hut and asked them, how far to the AAA? Well, 10 minutes that way was the answer. After about an hour of walking along a 4-lane road with few sidewalks and a lot of speeding cars, which by the way, those conditions exist in most American cities, we finally reached the AAA office. Needless to say, we did get a free map, but we took the bus back. I'm telling you this story because this is when I learned that 10 minutes that way does not mean walking, it means driving. And what it also means is that all of our communities have been designed for cars and built for cars. And their emissions contribute to climate change and poor quality of air quality, which in turn affects our public health, especially as average commute times get longer and longer, and the necessity of owning a car to reach work and other destinations creates inequities and dependencies that are just unsustainable. Today, we're going to explore that intersection of planning, climate change, public health, and the economy with our distinguished speakers over the next 90 minutes. But before we begin, CPEX would like to thank all of our sponsors, especially our platinum sponsors, Blue Cross and Blue Shield, Greater New Orleans Foundation, Power Coalition for Equity and Justice, and 89.3 WRKF, and our gold sponsors, American Planning Association, Louisiana Chapter, LSU Ag Center, and the Nature Conservancy. Closed caption is provided by AARP Louisiana. A few housekeeping items to address before we get started. Today's session has been pre-approved for continuing education for certified planners and certified floodplain managers. And if you're a certified floodplain manager, please fill out the survey that will appear when you close the Zoom window so that we can help you get continuing education credit. Realtors, architects, and landscape architects may self-report credit. Please visit the Continuing Education tab at our website, summit.cpex.org, for more information. You may turn on closed caption using the button on the bottom of your screen. We're reserving the final portion of the session for our panel discussion, including questions from you. Please enter your questions into the Q&A using the button on the bottom of your screen. And finally, we're recording the session, and all registrants will receive an email with the video link after the session. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Jalonne White-Newsome. Jalonne is the Senior Program Officer at the Kresge Foundation, where she has supported grant making as part of Kresge's Climate Change, Health, and Equity Initiative, and is responsible for the Environment Program's grant portfolio on climate resilient and equitable water systems. You can find her full bio on our website, summit.cpex.org. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for the kind introduction, Jeanette, and welcome to all of you who are joining us in this virtual meeting space. I miss being in person in Louisiana with all of you, but I have to say the fall weather in Michigan is quite beautiful right now. So speaking of Michigan and speaking of climate and COVID, it has hit our communities hard across the state. And as we begin this conversation, I think it's very important for me to recognize the original stewards of the land that I'm calling from in Michigan, the land of the indigenous peoples of the Potawatomi and the Mississauga. In many ways, when we talk about land acknowledgement, it reminds us of the harm that we have allowed, the harm that has hurt our land, our economy, and most importantly, our people. It is important that as we recognize indigenous knowledge, that in whatever problem we're attempting to solve, we must engage the genius and lived experience of experts on the ground, and those who have in fact and unfortunately been most impacted in order to create the best path forward. Now, the title of this session, Climate and COVID-19, the Diabolical Duo, makes it seem like we are about to talk about a Marvel Comics movie. But for this diabolical duo we are speaking of, this set of villains and antagonists, both climate change and COVID, are not only evil, but a deadly duo that has contributed to much loss in our society, particularly for poor people of color and indigenous communities. So I don't take this deadly duo lightly because my family and friends have been impacted and hit hard by both. Over the 15 years that I've been working on the health impacts of climate change, it was because extreme heat was hitting my grandparents hard and other senior citizens in my community. The impact of flooding has displaced my mom several times over the past 5 years from their home in Detroit, Michigan. And then comes COVID, exposing the serious cracks and faults that exist within many of our systems and institutions that are not in service to people and in fact fail to protect certain people because of the deeply rooted racism that pervades different aspects of our society. So we know that there is not one silver bullet that can tackle climate change, COVID, racism, or any of the challenges of our day. But if there is something that gives me hope, it is the beauty of crisis leading to opportunity. We all can play a role in helping our systems, institutions, our practices be more resilient to climate, COVID, and other villains. So the way we design and build better to withstand the intensity and frequency of climate events, the way we care for underserved populations in our health system, and the way that we ensure that our theories of change include a more sustainable economy. It will take all of us bringing our diverse set of talents, experiences, and sectors to the table to make it work. But I am also hopeful because as we discuss this deadly duo in COVID and climate, we have a triple threat. We have a talented three that make up our panel for today. And they are going to share their experiences and ideas about how they are addressing the work at the intersection of climate change, public health, economy, planning, and equity. So with that, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panel for today. So Peter Calthorpe is the Senior Urban Designer for HDR Calthorpe. Peter has been, I would say, a pioneer of innovative approaches of urban revitalization, community planning, and regional design. He was awarded the Urban Land Institute's prestigious J.C. Nichols Prize for Visionaries in Urban Development in 2006. He is also one of the founders and the first board president of the Congress for New Urbanism. His latest book, Urbanism in the Age of Climate Change, documents his work relating patterns of development to energy and carbon emissions. Welcome, Peter. Our next panelist will be Dr. Geoffrey Hill. He is a Donald C. Waite Professor of Social Enterprise at Columbia's Business School. Dr. Hill has made significant contributions to economic theory and environmental economics. He currently explores developments in energy markets, the impact of climate change on business, and the economics of corporate social responsibility. His latest book as well, Endangered Economies, How the Neglect of Nature Threatens Our Prosperity, sets out the economic and business case for environmental conservatism. And last but not least, Dr. Cheryl Holder, who is a fellow in the American College of Physicians and has dedicated her career to serving underserved populations. She has served as a medical director of one of Miami's largest community health centers in Florida. She is faculty at the Herbert Wertheim College of Medicine at Florida International University, where she focuses on teaching the impact of social determinants of health, addressing diversity in health professions through pipeline programs, and increasing the awareness of HIV prevention and the health impacts of climate change. And most recently, she was featured at the TED-Med 2020 TED Talk, giving her talk about clinicians for climate action. So with those introductions, I will turn it to Dr. Holder, who will get us started.
Just get my screen. Good morning, good morning. It's always a little bit with, it's always a little delay with our Zoom and this new technology. And it isn't quite the same, like you said, as when we're in person. Okay, sorry. So I just want to thank the summit organizers for inviting me to speak and being part of this honored panel here of esteemed scientists. And also for the attendees, as I'm reading more about smart growth, I see your goal is to create attractive, convenient, safe, and healthy communities. So we're sort of mission aligned in that we're trying to change the world. And of course, changing the world, we must. This year, 2020, has been an amazing year for all of us. Sad, like Jalonne says, possibly opportunities. But what we've definitely learned is that the truest threat to our stability as a species is not simply the existence of this deadly virus, but rather those gross societal inequities that it's been exposed. And this has really harmed us tremendously, but it exposed and showed and exacerbated conditions that are in existence and accelerated death. But also what we saw was a major disrespect of science and mixed messaging and an inability of our leaders to work together. For me, it's kind of sad, but for my entire career in doctoring for low-income people, I have to admit that I really am not surprised. As an HIV treater, many of us, unfortunately, have a little hashtag that we say, "Not my first pandemic." So for us, the outcome was inevitable. But the truth is, it doesn't have to be this way. But I don't want to spend all my little 15 minutes dissecting all the pandemics and pointing out what was wrong. What I want to do is sharing some of the stories of my patients. Jeanette shared her story in DC. And what we tell in these stories, especially my patients who have lived toughest lives with a lot of dignity, but they do give us a little harbinger of the way we can go forward. If you listen to the TED Talk, I talk about my patients being canaries in coal mines. There are prophecies telling us what will come because they're experiencing it now. We are in the midst of a truly existential threat that if we don't act now, within a few generations, life will be unrecognizable. And I don't want this moment to come, and we definitely don't want our children, our grandchildren to say, it didn't have to be this way. Of course, I'm talking about climate change. And just like coronavirus, the police, it's killing of Black and brown people right now. And the rates are higher than everyone else. The question is why? So we have to remember that context matters. And with all human lives, as the World Health Organization says, it's a matter of where you grow, where you live, where you're born, your access to money, the power, and the policies and politics that drive your health outcomes. It is the systems under which we live that really generates our ill health. And so when you think about what's happening to us in the climate, you see our genetics don't really play much role, but our physical environment, the social economic factors are what we're going to deal with. And that brings me back to about 2016 when I met Miss Anime. And I talk about her all the time because she was the person who opened my eyes to the inequities and connecting the dots with climate. A timer here. And so when she came in with all her multiple medical problems, high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, she also had COPD, and it was getting worse in 2016, a really hot time, and the humidity and the allergies were killing her, and she was being triggered. And so she was using her air conditioner, which she couldn't afford to use all the time. And she used it all the time. And she used up all her money buying more inhalers. And so at the end of the visit, she just slips me this form and says, could you fill this out? And this form was about getting help for her to pay a light bill. But what it was really more of was what was going on in our atmosphere. And I know you've already had a talk from Dr. Oppenheimer earlier in the week that talked about what's going on in that slim little blue area that surrounds our planet, that just right temperature, not too hot, not too cold, that we are filling with greenhouse gases. So then with all those gases creating that blanket, which takes it like from a thin little fleece blanket to a down-filled blanket that's warming our planet. And we're just getting too much heat. And we know where this heat is coming from. Transportation, electricity, just a little from agriculture, but it's what we're seeing throughout the world. And the worst part is that the poor people, because of their inability to make those changes, are exposed at much higher levels because of where they live. And in addition to the extreme exposure to pollution, they also have a higher energy burden, like Miss Anime. Her limited fixed income was eaten up more and more by trying to keep cool so she could breathe and stay alive. And when we look in the United States, in the Latin populations, almost 55% live in 3 states that are going to be seriously impacted by our climate. And 50% live in high levels with ground level ozone. And they're in employment that brings them directly in front of these areas that we see creating a lot of the problems in our communities. And much the same of the Black population. And this is a thing that in Alabama, I know Louisiana, you're experiencing much of the same impact in different ways. And in Alabama, they get tornadoes. And one of my medical students sent this to me right after that big tornado came through, which was like the top level of tornadoes, because we know the weather is more intense. And he says, people are missing, authorities fear that they could have literally been swept away from their homes. Worst of all, is that it went through very poor communities. And this is a picture from Lake Charles down after Laura went through. You see a young girl wading through the floodwaters. And we know what's happening to Louisiana more and more that will be impacted by these storms. And as the hot days and hot nights are increasing in the US, we know the effects. And this is my patient, Jorge. Jorge is a sweet man. He sells fruits, and you can see in the picture here that he sells fruits on the streets of Miami. If you ever come to Miami, there are all these street vendors, and they have bags of limes and oranges and guineps and other little fruits and flowers. And mostly they're undocumented people. And Jorge is undocumented. And he lived in this building behind the house because that's all he could afford. But Jorge had serious medical conditions, and in particular, his kidneys would worsen. And I was like, some days better, some days worse. And he'd come in and say, Jorge, it's really hot. You're getting dehydrated. You gotta come in from that heat. And he goes, rain or shine, cold or heat, I have to work. This is really his picture, because he wanted us to tell his story, because Jorge is sick and this is his legacy. He wants you to remember there are people like him, rain or shine, cold or heat, I have to work. And if that means his kidney goes, that's what it means, because Jorge has no other means of survival, and Jorge takes care of his family back in his home country. And then I think of Sandra Faye Twiggs. And if you ever get a chance, you can look this up. I can't show it today, but she was incarcerated after a fight with her daughter over a fan. When she presented to the judge screamed at her and said, I don't want to hear about your breathing. I don't want to hear about your coughing. And she kept coughing and said, Judge, I need my breathing treatment. Again, this was a very hot time in Miami, in Fort Lauderdale, where she lived. And she was so distraught that when she returned home, she didn't want to go back for any treatment, and she died 3 days later. We know the mental health issues are real after you've gone through a lot of trauma from displacement and severe weather and just day-to-day weatherization, we call it. We use that in medicine, what happens to poor people as their health declines over time. Interestingly enough, we call it weatherization of poverty. And we see that weatherization leading to mental health issues. And we won't forget, I lose these pictures and I want you to look at these pictures because these pictures are really telling you all the folks who are most vulnerable. And we see children because they live closer to the ground and closer to the ozone. And then we think about migration. And when I look at those pictures of folks evacuating from Grand Isle and the low-lying areas going up right before the second storm was coming in to hit Louisiana this year. And I think of last year, by 6 months into last year, the world had over 7 million people who migrated because of climate, because of places like Bangladesh and the low-lying areas, similar to Louisiana. And I see what happens in places like now with California, where almost a third will be under fire at some point during these fire seasons. And with 40 million people, where do they go? I think of my patient, Miss Madame Marie, she lives in Little Haiti. And in Florida, we have a sea level problem. And our sea level is forcing the rich people to abandon their, not abandon, but they're moving into higher ground because they still love Miami, but they know what's happening to the coastal regions. Property values have already declined in the coastal regions of Miami Beach and Key Biscayne and those richer areas, and they're seeking higher ground. And that higher ground is where my poor Black people lived. But they lived there for hundreds of years because it's right near the railroad tracks, the most undesirable property. But the engineers knew that railroads were best built on high ground, on sturdy land. So that's where the railroads are. And that's where now people are moving. So when we think of all the impact that climate has, extreme heat, air pollution, weather, all these diseases that come as the temperatures rise and the mosquitoes live longer and move north, and there's disruption of our water and food supply and disruption of our well-being, we're just at the tip of the iceberg of all the health effects that we could see. I use heat wave just to get to the top 8 that we often see now more than ever, but it's just a tip because there is so much more that we haven't learned. And when we think about it, African Americans and brown people and women are dying right now because of it. But it doesn't happen in a vacuum. Context matters. And policies drive so much of what happens to us. And we cannot forget one of the biggest policies that impacted the entire globe when man decided to describe humans based on a melanin production and called it race. And in that aspect from 1619 in this country, when the first person from Africa who was brought over to work the land for free, the slaves, and was called Black, created a cascade of policies, which then has led to many more racist policies. And as architects, and you know about the whole aspect of redlining, and where does that leave us with incomes, which then shows that Blacks and Hispanics making 59 cents of the dollar of whites and $1.23 for Asians, and Hispanics even less. So then how do we then put us to choose jobs that put us at the front line? We're in Florida, you see the death rates from coronavirus and COVID. And this is no different from across all of America, where we see Blacks 2 to 2.5 times dying more from coronavirus, similar with Hispanics and Native Americans. But it comes down to our social determinants. It comes down to where we live, where we work, and when we live in polluted environments, which accelerates our death, because even the study with coronavirus showing that just the long-term exposure to 2.5 particulate matter has increased your mortality. And by decreasing it just by even percentage, we see an increased survival. And the most probably unfair, or it's not unfair, but it's that the people who are suffering the most are the ones who have consumed the less of the products and consumed less of the factors that are leading to this global pandemic of climate change. But for Jorge, he died later last year after he made this, and he says this is what he wants you to remember his life, because it doesn't have to be this way. My patients are telling us that we're all vulnerable to the health impacts of climate change, but some of us, like them, Black and brown people and poor people, it's happening now. We can do something. And if you become our trusted messengers and the trusted architects, you can make those changes, but we gotta do the work. We gotta learn as much as we can about climate change. So coming to conferences like this is just the beginning, but there's more literature, there's Project Drawdown, educate, advocate. And when you come up with solutions, they must be equitable. They must be in a way that will reduce all the barriers. And that's why you're here figuring about how to make it more walkable, how to make our environment fairer, where poor people are not exposed to all these changes. But we can do this. We can create that world where we know it doesn't have to be this way. There is a lot of hope, there's a lot of change, and we keep learning and growing and succeeding in fighting and surviving this climate, this threat that we're facing. Thank you. Are we back?
And now we'll hear from Dr. Hill.
Great. Well, let me just share my screen, pull up some slides. Let me start by thanking Cheryl for that very interesting talk, not just interesting, but a very powerful talk and a very moving talk. It really does give a personal angle to what's going on in the world at the moment. I'm going to talk about some of the same issues, but from a rather more analytical and slightly drier perspective, I'm afraid. I'm going to talk about Louisiana, climate change, and the energy industry. I'm going to argue that Louisiana faces some real challenges from climate change and also from likely developments in the energy industry, but that there are potentially ways of overcoming these challenges. So it's a mixed message. It's a message that there are some real challenges out there, but that these are not insurmountable challenges. So, but basic point is Louisiana is very vulnerable indeed to climate and to energy shocks. To start off talking about climate, I'm sure you all know very well, Louisiana is particularly vulnerable to hurricanes. You've had more than your fair share already this year. In fact, there've been 14 hurricanes have hit Louisiana this century, and almost the same number again of tropical storms. So very, very vulnerable to tropical storms and hurricanes. Been very vulnerable to the loss of coastal land through erosion, and I'll say more about that in a second. Very vulnerable indeed to flooding from rainstorms. You've had several incidents where a great deal of damage has been done by floods caused not by sea level rise or by storms, but by rainstorms. And you have very, very hot, humid summers, unpleasantly hot and humid summers, quite threatening to life in many ways. And the key point, unfortunately, is that all of these things are going to be worse in the summer, worse in the future, unless we make some extensive changes to the policies we're carrying out at the moment. You know, hurricanes are going to get more intense. There'll be more loss of coastal land, hotter and more humid summers and so on. Here's a couple of quotes I found from the New Yorker magazine about the loss of land in Louisiana. Plaquemines has the distinction, a dubious one at best, of being amongst the fastest disappearing places on earth. Everyone who lives in the parish, and fewer people do, can point to some stretch of water that used to have a house or a hunting camp on it. This is true even of teenagers. A few years ago, the NOAA officially retired 31 Plaquemines place names because there was nobody there anymore. Goes on to say that what's happening to Plaquemines is happening all along the coast. Since the days of Huey Long, Louisiana has shrunk by more than 2,000 square miles. 2,000 square miles, that's quite a thought. If Delaware or Rhode Island had lost that much territory, the US would have only 49 states now. Every hour and a half, Louisiana sheds another football field's worth of land. Every few minutes, it drops a tennis court worth. I'm sure many of you are probably aware of that, but it does emphasize the rate at which coastal erosion is occurring in Louisiana. So Louisiana is vulnerable to climate issues. It's also very dependent upon the energy industry. Energy industry is a major source of income, of jobs, and of tax revenue. 63% of all US liquid natural gas exports are from Louisiana. 20% of all US petroleum refining capacity is in Louisiana. You've got a lot of energy intensive industries which have grown up in Louisiana, building on the presence and the availability of natural gas. Now, those are all positive aspects of the energy industry. You've got sources of income, sources of jobs, tax revenue, and so on. But it's also, the energy industry is also a major source of pollution and a health threat. In areas which are very energy intensive, there's a lot of pollutants generated by the activities of the energy industry. It's also one of the principal causes of subsidence, coastal subsidence, and the loss of coastal land, as I was just talking about. Currently, only 4% of electric power in Louisiana comes from renewables, and I'll contrast that with some nearby states in a second. Now, all of this is going to change radically in the next few decades, because the energy industry itself is going to change very radically. So let's just talk about the future of climate and the future of the energy industry. We're going to see more high-intensity hurricanes. More hurricanes are going to be in categories 3, 4, and 5. Fewer are just going to be plain vanilla tropical storms. We're going to see sea level rising. We don't know exactly how much sea level will rise, unfortunately, but it's expected to rise at least 2 feet this century and could possibly rise as much as 10 feet. The big unknown here is exactly how fast the various ice sheets will melt. There's a huge ice sheet covering Greenland. There's enough water in that ice sheet to raise sea level worldwide by about 10 feet. And there's also some huge ice sheets in Antarctica. If all of the ice sheets together, the ones in Greenland and in Antarctica, were meant to melt, it would raise global sea level by around about 200 feet. Now, those ice sheets are currently melting, and they're melting much faster than scientists expected them to melt to. And so the big uncertainty here is exactly how fast they'll melt. And of course, if we were to take effective climate policies and stop emitting greenhouse gases, then the melting would slow down and eventually stop. So we are facing more violent hurricanes. You're facing rising seas, anywhere from perhaps 2 to as much as 10 feet this century. More rainstorms, more of the floods associated with rainstorms. You're also facing hotter and much more humid summers. Summers in New Orleans are already hot and humid. I've actually been there a couple of times in the summer myself, so I'm very aware of this. And they could get much more so on both dimensions. So that's the future of climate change. The Louisiana climate. It's going to get tougher in many ways. The energy industry, what's happening there? So the energy industry is moving away from fossil fuels, and the energy industry in Louisiana right now is very, very heavily dependent on fossil fuels. So just as evidence of this, the share of coal in power generation in the US was 55% 10 years ago. Today it's 28% and falling quite rapidly. Analysts foresee that in the relatively near future, no coal will be used in the US. Today, wind power and solar power cost less than gas or coal for generating electricity. So many, many utilities are moving away from fossil fuels towards wind and solar. The entire US oil and gas industry today is actually worth less than any one of Apple, Amazon, or Microsoft. That's actually quite a remarkable fact. I mean, the US industrial sector used to be dominated by the oil and gas industry, but today, if you add the entire oil and gas industry together, it's worth less than Apple. It's worth less than Amazon. It's worth less than Microsoft. So it really is shrinking in capital value, and it's shrinking in economic importance. Peak oil consumption has either passed or is about to pass. People thought that oil consumption will continue to rise for the next 20 or 30 years, but that no longer looks to be the case. I listened recently to a talk by someone from BP, the big European oil company, arguing that, in fact, oil consumption had peaked and will only go downwards from now on. Other people reckon that it will peak within the next 2 to 5 years. So oil consumption is about to flatten and start dropping for sure. As oil demand falls, prices will fall, and a lot of high-cost US fields will be closed. Production of oil in the US costs anywhere from $15 to $50 a barrel. In the Middle East, you can extract oil for $5 to $10 a barrel. So as the price falls, US fields will become uncompetitive and unprofitable, and oil production will consolidate in the Middle East. Here's the bottom. Here is a headline that I saw recently in the Financial Times. It says Clean Energy Group NextEra, which is a big group providing wind and solar power, surpasses ExxonMobil in market capitalization. The oil major once had the world's biggest equity value, but has been overtaken by a green upstart. NextEra is a relatively new green company. So it just illustrates the point I was making up here about the entire US oil and gas industry being worth less today than Apple, Amazon, or Microsoft. Here's a chart that shows that same point. We've got time from 2010 to the present along the horizontal. This is the Dow Jones, what's called Dow Jones Total Return Index, which is a general index of the stock market going on upwards with a few dips. This is the same index for the oil and gas industry alone. And you can see the oil and gas industry has been falling in value relative to the rest of the US industrial sector. So it just emphasizes the fact I was making that the stock market is moving away from oil and gas, market capitalization is falling, and people see the prospects for oil and gas as being distinctly limited. Here's some data from a report by an organization called Climate Central on the state of Louisiana. It's about how many people are exposed to the risks associated with a sea level rise of 6 feet. How many people live within 6 feet of sea level? The answer is 1.1 million people live within 6 feet of sea level. And of those, around about 250,000 appear to be completely unprotected by dikes or barriers or seawalls or anything of that sort. And of them, about 65,000 are highly socially vulnerable people, poor people, people who are sick or ill, the kind of people, in fact, that Cheryl was talking about. Total value of property, which is less than 6 feet above sea level, is $39 billion, 39 billion with a B. And 7.8 billion of that completely unprotected again. You've got 4,500 miles of roads within 6 feet of sea level rise, all of them very vulnerable to being flooded. Let me emphasize, I said that sea level would rise at least 2 feet this century. It could rise quite a lot more than that. If you take even a minimum 2 foot sea level rise together with a hurricane strike, which would generate a sea surge of maybe 10 feet, then you can see that being below 6 feet is not a good place to be. Okay. This is again a list of the power plants, schools, houses of worship, and so on that are within 6 feet of sea level, all of which are vulnerable to storm surges or to possibly even to permanent sea level rise. So what does all this mean for Louisiana? It means that the hotter and more humid climate can damage the hospitality industry, which is a major source of employment in Louisiana. People like to travel to warm places, but not to very hot places. And if Louisiana can become significantly hotter and more humid than it is today, it could certainly damage the prospects of the tourist industry. Louisiana also needs to diversify away from oil and gas, as the oil and gas industries are going to decline and they'll become less reliable as sources of jobs, as sources of tax revenue, as sources of income for individuals. Now, Louisiana does in fact have great potential for solar and wind industries, both onshore and offshore wind. And I'll talk about that a bit. Texas, which is nearby, is actually the US's largest producer of renewable energy. The Gulf, the Mexican Gulf, has great potential for offshore wind. And Louisiana could easily become the base for engineering operations for offshore wind in the Gulf. And empty oil and gas fields in the Gulf offer potential for carbon capture and storage. One of the potential solutions to the climate change threat is to actually capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and pump it into places where it will stay permanently. And that means, for example, pumping it into disused gas fields and then capping those off when they're full. So that's something which could also become quite a significant industry in the Gulf of Mexico and based in Louisiana. Here's some data about Texas. Texas leads the nation in wind power generation, produces 28% of all wind-powered electricity in the US in 2019. This shows you various sources of electricity generation in Texas. This is natural gas. This is renewable energy, solar and wind. And solar and wind is growing very fast and will probably actually overtake natural gas in Texas within the next 5 to 10 years. The Texas solar industry employs more than 10,000 people and is recruiting people very aggressively. Let me give you an example of a town which is which I know quite well because it's from my home country, the UK, and which has sort of faced similar challenges to Louisiana and overcome them in an interesting way. Aberdeen is a town on the northeast coast of Scotland. It's on the North Sea. And for many centuries, it was a fishing town, successful, the medium-sized fishing town. Then back in the 1980s, oil was discovered in the North Sea, and Aberdeen became the center of offshore oil development, just as parts of Louisiana have become the center of offshore oil development in the Gulf. And Aberdeen became the richest town in Scotland by far. Then there was a drop in oil prices, and we saw the depletion of North Sea oil reserves, and that led to extensive job losses. And Aberdeen became something of a depressed town. A lot of the oil jobs left, and the sparkle went out altogether. Recently, it's been regenerated again by offshore wind. A lot of the technology which was used for producing offshore oil operations, a lot of the technology used in oil platforms is actually also used in offshore wind technologies. So two of the companies which were very active indeed in offshore oil and gas operations in the North Sea have now come to specialize in offshore wind. And the sort of platforms that they used to build for offshore oil and gas rigs are being used for offshore wind farms, and they're mounting turbines on them. And those two companies are a company called Ørsted, which used to be known as Danish Oil and Natural Gas, and a company called Equinor, which used to be Statoil, the Norwegian national oil company. Those two companies now specialize in offshore wind, and a lot of employment has returned to Aberdeen, and it's become a major center for offshore wind in the North Sea. There are also other possibilities, using, for example, wind power to generate hydrogen from water, and then hydrogen can also be used as a fuel, and it can be used as an alternative to fossil fuels. That's probably a slightly longer term prospect than wind and solar, but it's a very real one. And in Aberdeen, there is an industry growing up producing hydrogen from water using the abundant electricity from offshore wind. Okay, so what I've said is that Aberdeen, that the Gulf area, Louisiana in particular, faces two threats, two challenges. One is from climate change. One is from big changes that are coming in the energy industry in the next couple of decades. But if we take action reasonably quickly, and if you develop proactive policies, there are solutions to all of these challenges, and you could be still a prosperous and affluent, prosperous and stable area by the middle of this century. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hill. And now we'll hear from Peter.
Get all my pieces operating. Turn my video. Here I am. And I'd like to start also with my slides. And go to full screen. You know, somebody mentioned in one of the previous presentations that there is no silver bullet. I actually think there is a silver bullet. The silver bullet is how we choose to live. And in actuality, we don't get to choose. Our cities determine the lifestyles that we have, both in terms of economic opportunity, social interaction, social capital, and in terms of environmental impact. The way we shape our cities shapes our lives and shapes our interactions with one another and with the planet. So I think that when we look at these huge challenges, most of which are systemic and deep and long-term, you know, to a certain degree, the pandemic, I see as a lesser of the challenges we confront because it is something that will be resolved. It reveals a deeper set of systemic issues about social and racial inequality, and those are embedded in the way we shape our cities. So at the same time, cities show all of our worst and heaviest challenges. They are also the center of our biggest opportunities. And when you look globally, the migration to cities what has advanced tremendous success stories. And the mitigation of extreme poverty in the last 50 years has been remarkable. And it has to do with many developing countries, people leaving from rural poor areas into urban areas where fertility rates drop and women get access to jobs and education and literacy are more accessible, and where the centers of innovation catalyze in ways that create ideas and opportunities that we never dreamed of. You know, cities are complex nested systems. They combine, you know, if you take a minute and just browse this slide, they combine all these things. Each one of these things becomes a special interest group politically and tend to be advocated autonomously. And it's stovepipe thinking that is the greatest frustration to really solving our problems. When we see how we can connect the dots, where carbon emissions and building performance and travel behavior and household costs, affordable transport, air quality, all these things are linked by the shape of the cities that we build, land consumption and all the environmental ecological systems. Infrastructure design really drives a lot of the costs behind housing and city services. And of course, there's all the built environment as it impacts energy demand. So before we talk about solutions, we ought to talk about demands. Why do we demand so much of the planet? I think it has to do with the shape of our cities. Years ago, we did the help with the Louisiana Speaks Recovery Plan. And of course, it looked at all these dimensions comprehensively. There's no way to think about the future of coastal Louisiana without thinking about community, without thinking about restoration, without protection, and without where we spend the next generation of infrastructure investments to shape how we live. And so with this notion that we have to look at things comprehensively, what comes to the foreground, of course, is this tremendous vulnerability to climate change and flooding. But there are many solutions. And they have to do with the engineering, but they also have to do with preservation and expansion of wetlands as a buffer zone. And they also have to do ultimately with some migration of our population away from flood-prone areas. We always look at things in terms of scenarios. So we looked at the standard development future for Southern Louisiana. We looked at patterns that concentrated development more and more in existing cities on high ground with transit service. These are choices we can make where we settle. And of course, the differences are profound, and we have these choices to make. Just letting sprawl continue, of course, places more and more people in harm's way. And then there are various degrees of more compact and more high ground oriented development. Easy to do, and I'll give you an example actually next in Vietnam. But these things have secondary positive impacts. The less vehicle miles driven reduces household costs. It increases walking and transit trips, which can make a huge difference both to the environment and to our pocketbook and to our health. The total infrastructure costs for a more sustainable future turns out to be a lot less than continuing our pattern of sprawl. So not only is our typical pattern expensive to the environment, it's expensive to our government and therefore to us. Currently, we're working with Louisiana on response and recovery support, just getting data out there that is concerned with who's being impacted and how. And there's a whole range of issues that nest together: food security, medical response, logistics, housing and economic stress, natural hazard, climate risk. These all are things that are affected by our patterns of settlement. If you look at economic stress in Baton Rouge and New Orleans, you can see the surfacing of the impact of the pandemic, and of course, always more intensely, as was pointed out, on communities of color and low-income populations. as we look at the vulnerability to renters throughout the state, there is a global impact that's going on here for low-income households and their ability to sustain their mortgage and rents. So these vulnerabilities are coming to the foreground in ways that really, I think, bring us to considering really systemic change in how we build our cities and how our cities grow. We're working for the World Bank now in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, a city of 9 million, which has been sprawling just like Western cities sprawl. Sprawl is ubiquitous across the planet, and it is a environmental and human disease. It's a kind of virus, not unlike COVID. As the city expands, it expands more and more into high floodplain areas, which of course is tragic. The current numbers are stunning. Close to 400 square kilometers are in floodplain in Ho Chi Minh City, and another close to 600 kilometers are planned for growth. They're not even directing new growth away from flood-prone areas. So we developed a series of strategies for their future growth. And of course, the first is develop in safe and resilient sites. McKinsey did a recent study that reflects, some of the data you just heard. $3 to $7 billion of infrastructure damage is on its way to this city, and up to 18 billion in real estate impacts, and with knock-on costs, the economic and health factors, the number can reach 45 billion. We just can't afford to continue building cities the way we have. There are solutions. There's high ground sites within proximity, within transit distance. The distance, quite frankly, between New Orleans and Baton Rouge is the distance from historic Ho Chi Minh City and this large high ground area. So adaptation through migration is a reality. It's starting now, and it's a necessity. It's painful. It displaces people and communities, and yet, of course, the floods will do the same. We need a low carbon solution to mobility. We can't continue with the automobile. And what was exciting about Ho Chi Minh City is that they are investing heavily in metro, a backbone transit network. It is a denser city than many in Louisiana, and I'll talk about better solutions in America than these. But what most fascinated me, if we look carefully at the nature of a place and the culture of a place, this is a city in which 91% of trips are on motorcycles. If those motorcycles converted to electric bikes, and if we gave those electric bikes private right-of-ways, it turns out that that is a more environmentally sound transit system than any other we know, interestingly enough. About 30,000 passenger trips per lane can take place on e-bikes. That's actually larger than what you get with a peak hour capacity of a light rail system or the peak hour capacity of a BRT system. So interesting that there are unique solutions throughout the world. But this one is not unique. Mixed use, walkable, transit-oriented communities are now a global strategy, and it's something that's well known. In, of course, much of the developing world, these nodes become very high density, higher density than we're accustomed to, but that's healthy and robust. Neighborhoods need to be mixed use in terms of the kind of housing integrated with the kind of civic and local destinations, all within walking distance. The ecological systems actually is quite similar to southern Louisiana. Huge mangrove forest is their storm surge buffer, and protecting and expanding it is at the forefront of thinking ecologically in this city, as it is, must be in yours. But as we build communities, green spaces become more and more critical for drainage and detention, and for heat island effects, as well as livability. These are the classic cases where cities create what I call co-benefits. You solve for one problem, drainage. You also satisfy other issues like close by recreation and climate change impacts. Within neighborhoods, there needs to be porous ground and drainage. These are all things that simultaneously solve technical problems, but also create more beautiful living environments. Heat island effect is something that the world and cities will be responding to. This is a mapping of Ho Chi Minh over time from 95 to 15, where the urban extent expands, and of course, in parallel, heat island effect dramatically expanding. What are the solutions here? Well, cheap and wonderful. The answer is a tree. Trees, green spaces, shade, canopies. These are what people love anyway. So whenever I find a solution that involves love as well as numbers, I think you're onto something really good. Just thinking about how air movement moves through the city is another thing. We're technically capable of all this kind of analysis and design intelligence. Now, let me bring it back to the United States and my state, California, which has been burning, and we are experiencing the double hit of pandemic and climate change in very real ways. But under the surface is that other profound stress point, which of course is affordable housing. We have a housing deficit of 2 million. And so our housing affordability statewide is only 50% of the current population can afford the housing stock that's available. Why? Because we haven't built enough of the right kind of housing. I want to back up for a minute and just touch on something that I think has been misunderstood, which is the fiscal crisis. Everybody thought it had to do with subprime mortgages and the fault of regulation and Wall Street. The truth of the matter is, it was really because we built too much of the wrong kind of housing in the wrong place. This is a foreclosure map in '98. You can see around Chicago, fairly even where foreclosures happen. All of a sudden in 2015, in 2008, during the crisis, you see that all the foreclosures are in distant subdivisions, low density, drive to only, the kind of drive till you qualify way of thinking about housing affordability. Of course, the long drives cost a lot of money. Up to 20% of household income goes in that direction, and maybe 30 to 40 to housing. Between the two, it's over 50% of household expenditures. And that drive not only is debilitating in terms of household economies, but also in terms of the environment and in terms of the social health of our families and our communities. People are missing for 2 hours a day in ways that they don't need to be missing. What's going on here? Not advancing. So what is the solution? The solution is to remake the worst parts of our environment. America is built around strip arterials. The least loved place in our communities. We think it's important because that's where the cars are most mobile, but that all can change. This offers a great opportunity for transitioning to a whole new urban pattern. Infill on commercial land on our strips will take what is underutilized land now because of Amazon. Less bricks and mortar, more shopping online means that all these parking lots are going to less and less value. So we tried just looking at a few of them in my neighborhood, El Camino Real, a 43-mile strip through the heart of Silicon Valley, where, by the way, the affordable housing crisis is highest, where we can't afford, people who work at low-wage jobs can't afford to live anywhere near Silicon Valley and the economic opportunities that it enjoys. but we could place a large amount of housing in the heart of it by redeveloping the strip. So here is just a mapping using the same tool that we used in Louisiana, urban footprint, that just shows all the commercial underutilized land along that strip. And the question became, well, how much does that represent? How much opportunity? Is this a footnote or is this a big thing? Once again, we know that these kinds of places along the strip are dying, dead, undervalued, low in terms of tax returns, and therefore, because property taxes are so important to education, at least in our state, we underfund our schools, and a whole series of cascading problems come out of that. As I say over and over again, the city is a nested networks where one phenomena always has ripple effects that you can trace fairly easily. It turns out we could fit 250,000 homes on that one boulevard. And by the way, those homes would consume less water, use less energy, 33% reduction in driving, 45% reduction per household in greenhouse gases, and cost less, $3,000 per annum less in transportation per household. So it's affordable to the environment and to people, and it puts people at the heart of the historic region. We don't need distant suburbs. We need to infill along these boulevards. I now call them grand boulevards because I think that's what they can become. This is a mapping of the Inner Bay Area and all the sites. And when you expand from that one boulevard to all the boulevards, we're talking about 15,000 acres of land, which gives us around 400 miles of high capacity transit opportunities and has a positive environmental impact. The single, actually better than the single boulevard analysis. And when we map for climate vulnerable lands, which in our case, red is fire zones and blue is flooding, it turns out that this is the one right place to put new housing, to satisfy housing needs and to drive down the cost of housing and to bring affordable housing into the heart of our economic engine, Silicon Valley. So this is a many-pronged solution. We did the same analysis for LA County, 1.6 million units of housing possible by converting commercial land alone. And that, of course, puts these ribbons of urbanism at the doorstep of existing communities, creating a distributed solution to our housing crisis, not a concentrated affordable housing solution. Well, to support all this density, we need better transit, and we can't afford light rail and metro. We just can't afford it. We're not wealthy anymore, although we think we are. Bus rapid transit globally is one of the most cost-effective, and it, of course, sits on those boulevards. In China today, there's autonomous transit buses. I think more interesting is what they're playing with in Singapore, which is autonomous vans. They all depend on private right-of-ways so that they are not locked into the congestion that is typical, and it gives riders of transit an advantage of not being locked down at peak hour. So one solution is to convert these boulevards, the grand boulevards, not only with housing and shops at the ground floor and walkable places and bike lanes, but also with the next generation of transit. I think one step is with buses. An even smarter way is with the vans, which allow people to cluster origins and destinations, literally increasing the average speed of a transit trip, reducing the operations and maintenance costs by 40%, and reducing construction costs by 75%. It's my theory, if we have a fast, convenient, inexpensive transit technology, all of a sudden we can make it ubiquitous, and the more ubiquitous it is, the more accessible and the more usable it is. It's hard for many people in America to imagine getting away from the car, but it's completely possible, and I think, quite frankly, inevitable. But it's really about creating places that are healthy in terms of life and community. So instead of those barren boulevards lined by parking lots, we could have active walking streets and sidewalk cafes and bikeways and transit, that tree canopy and all the housing we need close to the job centers. So this is a systemic solution that I think is emerging for the United States in ways that I think are pretty profound. Churchill said, when we shape our buildings, they shape us. I think when we shape our cities, thereafter they shape us. And they shape our opportunities, our capacity for equity, our capacity to live lightly on the land. I'll end with these design principles. What is a sustainable community? It's a place first where preservation is foremost, whether it's the wetlands that protect the city, the natural ecologies and habitat, the agrarian landscapes, whether it's established neighborhoods or cultural heritage. First and foremost is to preserve the values that are in place. Second is mixed use. We can no longer afford the segregated city. And by mix, I don't mean just housing and shops, I mean income groups. We can't isolate by age, segregate by income. We need integrated communities to create robust economies and cultures. We need street networks that connect for the pedestrian and the bike, not just the automobile. And there's metrics to all of this. This is work also for the World Bank, trying to set a series of benchmarks of what a sustainable city, what are the goals and the metrics of a sustainable city. We need gathering places that are close by and diverse, that help shape and create common ground for our communities. We need places for people to walk and bike. The two-wheel vehicle, whether it's electric or pedal, is the most efficient form of transit on the planet. We need to enhance our transit systems, and there are many different forms that can take. I outlined one of them, but giving up the private automobile with or without a steering wheel, this idea that autonomous vehicles are gonna solve our problems, I think is a frightening fantasy that will just fuel more suburban sprawl. And finally, we need to focus our densities and our infill along these corridors that exist everywhere and that are accessible to all the surrounding existing neighborhoods. It's a walking destination that lands you at a place you want to be rather than a parking lot. So that's, I'll exit. How do I exit out of that? Stop share. Here we are. That's what I wanted to point out. It's a lot, but I think that the economy of cities, the politics of communities, the environmental impacts are all converging on a new consensus about how we need to grow our cities. And therein lies a silver bullet, I believe. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Peter. And if I could ask all of our speakers to come back on camera so we can start our discussion. A lot of great stuff, great stories, great data, great ideas. And so I've been trying to really follow the thread of the questions that we've been receiving, but really want to start with a question around migration, which each of you touched on. And Dr. Holder, if you could kick us off, there was a question asking if you've seen any type of research or examples of inclusive, meaning including indigenous peoples in planned migration or retreat. And if you have, you know, is there something that can put us on this path to hope, a policy path, or what other things do we need to get to this place where there is kind of this inclusive planned migration or retreat for folks in Louisiana and possibly other places?
I think the only policy that I've been seeing around migration is the buyouts. And we never think of it as migration, but there are certain policies, especially with sea level rise. And do we rebuild? Do we buy out land, buy out the homes? And I think in Louisiana, you've had several communities that have been bought out where they receive settlement from the government to move. Those policies often are fought because people hate disrupting their lives. So I'm thinking of internal migration. So much of the external migration that you see happens, I don't have a lot of history that I can come to that says we allow the folks to move and there's a planned movement. Like when we think of what happened in Syria, or what's happening now in Guatemala with the coffee plantations and the coffee farmers and the migration north. But internally in the US, we're seeing government buying out property. And that was one of the big areas that we looked at in South Florida with our sea level rise. How much land are we going to buy back? That's the area we see in planning. It's not directly, but it's how much insurance you'll get. And the insurance industry has been pushing people to make that decision on where they're going to move. But a system-wide plan of migration, other than I think I hear that, and Peter will talk about it. He can talk about it, I think, with Ho Chi Minh City and some of the plans there. And there's some plans in low-lying places like Bangladesh and other places. But in the US, I don't hear the plans as yet, other than in buying out the properties.
Thank you. Peter, did you want to respond?
Sure. I see it as a progression. You know, you can't ask people to move to places that are unknown and unattractive. And so the first step is to create the right kind of receiving areas where people would want to be. And that needs to be populated first by new people coming to the region and landing on high ground in mixed income and mixed use places, maybe along those boulevards, the grand boulevards idea, or maybe in, I don't think the standalone new towns are actually very expensive to prop up a whole new set of institutions and infrastructure. And we have this capacity for infill. If we make the infill affordable and a wonderful way to live, it will begin to attract people naturally. And as it gains momentum, the ability for people to accept a buyout and shift into a new place will be easier if that receiving place really works and is truly integrated in terms of income and job accessibility and community services. So we need this job of infill and redevelopment in a balanced way is step one, because it then becomes the receiving platform for people that truly do need to migrate.
Thank you.
I guess there's been some buyout in New York as well, just following what Cheryl said. A lot of coastal communities were severely damaged by Hurricane Sandy in 2012, both in New York and in New Jersey, actually. And there's been a lot of debate about what to do about that, because clearly the same thing could happen again at any time in the near future. And part of the solution has been sort of government buyout of some of the coastal housing. The problem with that is, as Cheryl says, people don't like to move. I mean, they've chosen to live in these places. They've been there in many cases for a long time. And at the same time, it's obviously expensive for the government. And this property, you know, coastal property is quite expensive typically. And so buying out 50 houses or 100 houses is really quite expensive. You can do it occasionally on a small scale, but as a kind of generic solution to the coastal flooding problem, it's just not going to work because it's going to be too expensive for the communities to do that on a big scale. And there's a lot of discussion these days of managed retreat, you know, in quotation marks, as a potential solution, but it's not clear to me really what it means or how you actually do manage retreat from the coastline in a fair and reasonably economically efficient way. It's more Peter's field than mine, I guess.
Yeah, because Dr. Oh.
Yeah, I do think I think it's a generational shift. The idea that people are just going to get money and pick up and leave their historic neighborhoods and homes and the social fabric that exists. I remember working in New Orleans after Katrina, and it was just clear that people loved their neighborhood, even, you know, especially the Ninth Ward. And so, you know, that's not going to happen. But the next generation may find a desire to shift. And I think we can do this with generational transitions.
And kind of my question, Dr. Hill, and it's coming up in a couple of the chats, is how do we pay for this? So if buyouts is one option, how do we pay to, as Peter said, kind of create the right type of receiving areas? Are there other ways that we need to look at climate change mitigation and adaptation, particularly from your standpoint, as you talk about like the decline of coal and oil and the possibilities of renewable? And someone in here, Christopher, mentioned, nuclear power is huge as well. And wind might be a poorer option and has economic problems, but solar does have problems. So how do we begin to make this shift, this economic shift?
A lot of questions in there, Jalonne. That's tough. So some of the shift is happening anyway. The shift from coal to renewable energy, for example, that's happening just because renewable energy has come down in price. It's actually, I can't easily show you the numbers here, but the drop in the cost of solar power is spectacular. Solar power used to be something like $300 a kilowatt hour, a megawatt hour, and it's now down to about $30. It's come down by 90% or more over the last 10 years. That's very recent. Wind has also come down dramatically in cost too. So because of that, most utilities are moving away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. Somebody asked about nuclear. I'm actually quite enthusiastic about nuclear in many ways. The first job I ever had was designing nuclear power stations, and I worked on nuclear power stations for quite a long time. But unfortunately, nuclear power is just rather expensive. It really is. And it's probably not a good thing to build in areas which are prone to being hit by hurricanes either. You really don't want accidents at nuclear power plants. I think in the right place, nuclear power is perfectly safe, but the right place has to be picked rather carefully. But it's expensive, and we can produce power from wind for 3 or 4 cents a kilowatt hour. Nuclear is about 15, which is 5 times as much. I mean, it really is a dramatic difference in cost there. So there was a lot of discussion of a renaissance of nuclear a few years back, but that's been really killed by the drop in the price of natural gas, which comes from fracking, and by the drop in the cost of solar and wind. Now, your original question was, how do we pay for these transformations? There's no silver bullet there, unfortunately. And I think that the growth of some of these new sectors will provide a new basis for taxation. And I think that I emphasize that how many people are being employed in the wind sector in Texas and solar sector, in Texas, for example, and a similar number are being employed in the wind sector. So these are very rapidly growing industrial sectors. They're providing a lot of jobs. There's some income tax there, there's some sales tax, there's corporate profits tax, and all of that can provide a basis. But I think that the population has to share some of this. And I think people are probably going to have to make some contributions themselves to the costs of moving, unfortunately. I mean, that may be an element of social insurance there. And I think that ideally, I'd like to see this be free for people who are low income, but some contribution from people who are in higher income groups. And many higher income groups are moving anyway. Cheryl mentioned this, and it's very clear. And if you look at the data in your part of the world, Cheryl, I mean, the coastal property values, which, coastal property, seafront property used to be the choice, right? Really, really expensive. Mm-hmm. That's coming down in price a bit these days. That's because rich people are moving away from the coast. And as Cheryl said, they're buying some of the higher ground properties in the Miami area. So I think rich people can be kind of left to handle this themselves. And what we need some subsidies in sort of low and middle income people handling this problem.
And my population has said, use the equity lens. And if you use the equity lens and listen to the population, jobs mean a lot. They can pay for themselves and they'll pay for their own move. Yeah. It's what opportunity, like Peter says, where's the opportunity? Nuclear energy, definitely with the health industry and the health effects, one fall. And I mean, right now, some of our nuclear in Florida is like 9 miles away and near the coast. And that's going to be with sea level rise, a huge concern. But wind, solar, and other energy efficiency can help us tremendously. How do we get our low and middle income communities involved in the solution? How do we get them in the jobs? If you remember what happened with the great migration from Blacks from the South, it was moving north, and that was like almost 2 million moved in a matter of 5-10 years. That was a huge migration of Black people from the South for jobs. If people really have the ability, if they're empowered and have places, like you said, places to go and appropriate jobs, with the appropriate education and skills, you could solve this 5 to 10 years with people doing the move themselves and not reluctantly, not being forced, but this is by choice. We saw it with the Dust Bowl migration that went out to California. We saw it with the Black migration. We're seeing it again in Central America. We saw it with the Syrians. So we can use some of our current resources, but we have to build in the jobs, the education. And I got to bring up trees, because in my community, trees are loved, but no one uses the equity lens, and no one says they're growing faster than ever. The city finds me when my sidewalk breaks and when I can't do the pruning. I don't have any money to do all this pruning. The trees are huge. One storm, they come down. I'm going to get rid of my trees.
Oh.
Environment that needs the trees the most, because no one uses the equity lens and says, how do I help a poor person keep their trees? So there's a little bit more. It's a little bit more than just these solutions. And this is why we say we've got to bring our people involved in the community in expressing their understanding and helping become empowered to make that choice. Then it's not forced. And these are real decisions. So you don't plant trees and next week somebody chopped them all down.
Well, going from the detail to an area I know that typically we don't want to talk about, which is I think we need to redefine what security means in America. And, you know, there are budgets that nobody seems to question anymore. The military budget is an extravagance if you really define what security means in our country to our people. It's a waste, largely a waste. And if we can redirect some of those funds to solving climate change issues and solving affordability issues and solving migration, easing migration problems, that is true security. That creates true health for our community. The other point I would make is there is self-financing that embedded in all this. When we studied the affordable housing Grand Boulevard strategy, it turned out that we generated $43 billion of bonding capacity in the 5-county area we were looking at. 43 billion that could go to schools and parks, affordable housing and social services, a tremendous amount of money that wasn't coming into the public sector because we had dormant land. And so there are feedback loops like that that are really fortuitous when we get it right.
Mm-hmm. And I think what's interesting, you know, in terms of an equity lens, and while we all have kind of this North Star of what we want to see, what's also important is the process and who's involved. And there's a question around the opportunity to engage those that work in public health to address some of these socioeconomic concerns. And I'm just wondering, you know, Dr. Holder, the question for you is, how engaged have you been, or have you seen opportunities to engage with planners and economists? And then for Dr. Hill and Peter, how often do you engage with public health professionals as you are making these decisions and informing and influencing policy? So Dr. Holder, let's start with you.
Well, this is new, and this is really an opportunity. This is the first time I've been with architects and planners in this group. And this is a good change. I'm seeing it across the climate activist world and advocacy world, where the health message is taking much more prominence. The only little drawback is that often it becomes the data showing that's the only thing that gets people to move. One of the biggest things that gets people to move. So I hate that it might be used as a marketing tool rather than truly incorporating what we need to keep people alive, because many times we forget why we develop the cities and why we do what we do. It's really for the people. And so I am beginning to see an understanding across the board. Much of like in Florida, we have a resiliency planning, and we're putting together a whole group of resiliency for climate, 305 resiliency. And that has the health, has architect planning, it's across the board. So I think with the newer generation and with what we're facing, I'm seeing it. Coronavirus has really pushed us to come together. Because again, like you say, it's exposed so much of the inequities, it's exposed the vulnerabilities, and it also exposed how our government can come up with $2 trillion. That's a lot of money. So if we can come up with $2 trillion to make some of these changes as relates to surviving this pandemic, it tells me that we have the ability to come up with the dollars and make those changes. So the future looks good because it's beginning. I see baby steps towards it.
You know, let me spring off that a little bit. I think we all live in the political world. We understand politics actually defines the boundaries of what we can think about, what we can invest in, and what we can do. And politics is about coalitions. And, you know, when I work in city planning, I end up working with a huge spectrum of groups, from developers who have an agenda, to city managers who have fiscal responsibilities, to low-income communities, to environmentalists. Everybody sees it through their lens. Now, the great thing is when you can get coalitions to reshape themselves and become more powerful. You know, I have to say, tragically, the environmental community and the equity community have not been close as coalition partners. And yet climate change is the place where they can come together. You know, affordable housing advocates don't seem to understand that transportation is a big part of solving for that fundamental livability issue. So embedded in these urban design questions and solutions are intrinsic coalitions. And if we can get those coalitions to really coalitions, then I think we have profound political change opportunities.
If I just pick up one point you made there, I'm actually actively involved with a lot of environmental organizations. I actually, beginning in the last year or so, to see some active interaction between environmental groups and sort of, you know, communities of color and groups of that sort. And this is something which didn't happen 5 years back, but it's happening on an increasing rate at the moment. And I think we're increasingly perceiving that the health effects of climate change can be very substantial. And obviously they will fall primarily on poor people. You know, Cheryl gave us a sad example with, I forget the gentleman who died a couple of years ago. Jorge, that's right, yes.
Died in November 2019.
Yeah, that's sad. I mean, he, you know, one of the things we're studying a lot these days is the impact of heat on health. And heat has a lot of impact on health. People who are continuously exposed to temperatures over 95 degrees and conditions of high humidity suffer a lot. It can make a lot of existing conditions worse, but it can also induce conditions that didn't exist before. And poor people obviously don't have the capacity to run air conditioning continuously. So there's a big impact. Let me just make one more point. You talked about the need for investment in this area. Now is a great time to invest. You know, we need to boost the economy. And the interest rate on 30-year US government bonds is 1.4% at the moment. But the US government can borrow money for 30 years at 1.4%. I mean, that's almost giving it away. I mean, the inflation rate is probably 1%. So that in real terms, that's about 0.5%. So this is a time when the US government should be borrowing massively in order to invest in these types of issues.
Thank you, Dr. Huron. We're coming to the closing of our time, but I want to allow Peter and Cheryl, if you want to leave folks with one piece of advice in 10 seconds or less.
Ooh.
I know that's hard. So Dr. Hoda, I'll start with you.
I say do the work, learn more about this, learn about possible solutions, and remember the people involved, that it's happening now and they're very vulnerable and they can only tell their stories because they don't have the money like a billionaire to go create some extractor or do anything. So they share their lives with you and their stories so you can remember that when you make these changes in these cities, you're shaping lives, you're doing more, you're keeping our communities going. And there are people who need you and need your voices for them to live and grow and feel that connectedness as to humanity. We really want you at their most vulnerable moment to remember that we're all in it together, we're all humans, and protect their humanity and protect their dignity and help them to live.
Thank you. Peter.
You know, I think the most important thing that I think to answer that question is we share sometimes unarticulated paradigms. You know, the American dream, the idea of a cul-de-sac and a couple cars and a single family dwelling has driven our vision of what the good life is for, you know, ever since World War II, when we subsidized its way into reality. It wasn't a natural form. It was a contrived form through redlining, through highway bills, through mortgage insurance. A whole bunch of mechanisms went into creating an urban form that the planet had never seen. If we re-envision that, and we have to now, because of climate change, because of housing affordability, because of structural economic segregation, we have to re-envision what the American dream is in the physical sense. What does that life look like? What kind of community is it? And then we can underwrite that vision, just like we underwrote suburban sprawl after World War II. And we can solve many problems. To get to that vision, we need coalitions. We need environmentalists to stop just thinking about habitat and start thinking about the human habitat. We need affordable housing advocates to understand that they got to solve for working class housing as well as low income housing. Every group that you look at has to think beyond their own boundaries in order to build coalitions and shape a vision that's really sustainable and inclusive.
Thank you. And Dr. Hill, in addition to invest now, is there anything else in 10 seconds or less that you'd like to leave with the audience?
These problems are all solvable, but we've got to start now. As I think it's Cheryl mentioned in her talk, we've wasted 20 years, and we shouldn't waste another even 2 years. Hopefully, there'll be a change of government in January to a group that's much more interested in this, and they'll tackle these problems. But we cannot afford to waste another even 1 or 2 years.
So remember humanity.
Last story for urban planning. Okay, that's okay. No,
I think
I just have the effect of the city on my mother. My mother is now 91, going on 92. She came from Jamaica and she came to New York City. And she says, every immigrant must come to New York. It change you, it train you, it teach you how to live. Dilly-dally, you better get to that subway. It makes you meet people. She will tell you that that city is what made her be a successful with all her natural talents. So it is so important what work you're doing in crafting the people who will live in it. Because as brilliant as my mother was, she says if it wasn't for New York City, she wouldn't be here. And she's still alive and fighting. Thank you for your work.
Awesome, awesome. So thank you again, Dr. Holder, reminding us to remember humanity. Peter for re-envisioning with coalition and in coalition. And Dr. Hill just reminding us to start now. We cannot delay any longer. So again, please give a verbal appreciation to our speakers, whether it's in the chat or the Q&A. And again, thank you to our sponsors. Thank you for being here. And I have some reminders. If you are a certified floodplain manager, please fill out the survey that will appear when you close the Zoom window so you can get your continuing education credit. And please, everyone, don't forget to mark your calendars for the next session of CPEX Smart Growth Summit. On November 5th, we have Relapse or Resilient, Healthy Community Design. This session will explore the ways in which COVID-19 has exposed gaps in our infrastructure that has exacerbated impacts of the pandemic and prompted us to rethink what is entailed in healthy community design. Again, thank you all so much for your time and attention, and stay safe and well.